and start the presentation. We've got probably only half of the people I'm expecting, so hopefully some others will join or listen to it later. Okay, this afternoon is going to take two parts, and I'll address one of the questions that's come through in a minute. We're going to spend the first short part of the afternoon just having a look at the module as a whole and the handbook and other pieces of information that I think are vital. Then we might take a short break, and then we will come back to do an introduction to research and to the research process. One of the things that I'm very aware of is I have no idea about your previous research experience. So if you were going to rate your research knowledge from 1 to 10, 10 being a chair of professorial standard in a university and 1 being absolutely nothing, where would you rate at the moment your research knowledge? I'll wait for some answers here. Okay, well we've got sort of a scope here. We've got 0, which I'm sure is not true, and then we've got sort of mid 5s to 6s. So you know what research is, you're pretty aware of research, but maybe you don't remember necessarily what research is and what research is about, or you're not familiar with some of the topics and the phraseology. And one of the things that I always say about research to all of my students, whether they be pre-registration undergraduates, post-registration undergraduates and post-registration postgraduates, it's complicated, is that research is couched in really quite difficult language. We like to use terms like interpretive phenomenology and epistemology and things like that, and it's all about understanding what that language is. So when we start that presentation, we'll have a little bit of a conversation about research terminology. So what I'd like to do to begin with is to ask, are you all familiar with the Moodle site, and have you been able to access it? Hopefully the answer to that is yes. I've got a hand raised from Rachel. Do you have a question for me? Yes, sorry, Moodle is the same as the digital learning environment, as is the way with Plymouth University. We like to change things every year, so the language changes, but the digital learning environment, yes, Moodle digital learning environment is exactly the same. And there have been a number of documents and a number of pieces of information that I've put on, and hopefully you're stating that some of you have got some ongoing problems, that you can access the MCH 501 site, and on that will become additional information as we go along. So one of the things that I would advise you is to just keep looking, keep in touch with it. If we navigate through the site, there's certain key pieces of information I'd like to draw your attention to firstly. There's the introduction folder, and then there's day 1, day 2. As those days will become populated by the people who are running those days, and we'll go through that in a minute, there's the reading list, and some people have emailed me to say that they cannot access the reading list or couldn't find the reading list. Hopefully you can all find the reading list over in the left-hand corner. But we'll start by having a quick look through the presentation. So you can hopefully all see the PowerPoint presentation on the webinar at the moment. I'm having a few technical problems here. And hopefully that's gone on to slide number 2 and what we're going to cover. So first thing, we'd like to have a look at the plan for the module. Now, as you may be fully aware by now, is there is a distance learning module. All these sessions will be delivered via webinar or narrated PowerPoint. I am very much the coordinator of this module, but I'm not going to be delivering all the content. So the sessions that we are having are every couple of weeks on a Monday between 1 and 4. So the dates that I'm sure you are now fully aware of are today, day 1, day 2 is on the 6th of October, and the timetable or plan for the module is on the DLE now. And the 6th of October is going to be with Heather Skirton. Then we've got the 20th of October with me, then the 3rd of November and the 17th of November are being delivered by Ruth Endicott. At the moment, she's going to be delivering those as narrated PowerPoints, and I'm not quite sure when she will be loading them, but they will be prior to those dates. If on those dates you would like some tutorial support from me, so that's the 3rd and the 17th of November, we can do that either through email or via a phone call. Then we have the 1st and the 8th of December being delivered by Bridie Kent and then Heather Skirton again. And at the end of that session on the 8th of December, I will be coming in for the last 5 minutes of the webinar to do a module evaluation. Okay, so if we've got any questions on the plan for the module, please ask. The more interactive this is, the better. So please do type in a question if you've got one. Where is the reading list? If you go to the DLE page, the main page, there is, if you look to the left-hand side, there is the a electronic reading list. If you click that, that takes you to your Talis Aspire, which is an electronic reading list, and you should be able to click all the links on that. It's very much a preliminary reading list. It is not a definitive reading list, and every single separate session will have additional reading materials supplied by the people delivering the session. Okay, so hopefully that answers your question. So if you look at the main DLE page, you will also see the handbook. And if we could spend a brief moment looking through the handbook or module information booklet that we have. I can't see the list. Okay, if I go back to the DLE homepage. Are you on the DLE homepage? The Digital Learning Environment Module Handbook homepage, module homepage. If you go up to the left, there should be a reading list and it says MCH 501. You should be, if you click MCH 501, you will go straight to the reading list. Yep, great. If you can't access the DLR, okay, got it, great, thank you. If you can't access the DLE, is that because you aren't registered yet or you can't see it? If that's the case, I will email it to you, Rebecca, as soon as the session's finished. But hopefully once you are registered on the site, you should be able to see the DLE fully. Okay, right, well, admin problem, maybe we'll have an email conversation at the end of the session then. That's all right. When you do access the module information book, there's a series of pieces of information regarding, am I using the PU chat room? No, I don't think I am. Sorry to address another question as it comes through. I'm just using this simple question format, Rachel, at the moment. If that's okay. If you look at the module handbook, there's the normal information. There's an introduction to the module, which has got some module information which is useful, some contact information, and the admin staff I'm sure you're all very aware of now. And the module overview, which is on page 8, which talks about the first of the 2 research modules. What we expect, what we will be covering throughout the programme, how it's going to be delivered, so it's all going to be delivered completely online. And even though it's completely online, it doesn't mean that there isn't going to be the opportunity to either have a telephone conversation for support or some additional tutorial support via email. Indicative content is a list of the basics that we will be covering, the electronic reading list, the recommended reading list, and as I stated, although there's a very brief overview reading list that's available on the DLE at the moment, each separate session and each of the professors will be providing additional reading material for the sessions that they are developing. And then we come to the assessment information. So the assessment is what we're all interested in, and that follows the critical review of the literature, and we'll be covering that in a little bit. Additional to that, there's some information about module evaluation and student responsibilities and the definitive module record. So the handbook is there as an information source. I've already spoken a little bit about the plan of the module and the timetable, and the programme plan or programme timetable is up on the DLE. At this point, I would like to apologise for any confusion that may have been from the fact that rooms have been booked and you thought it was a contact module. That was an administrative error, and hopefully we've resolved that now. So the timetable is there, and if there are any changes or any developments, that will go on the DLE homepage, so do check it regularly. Latest news and so on. Please ignore the upcoming events section because that puts rooms that have been booked through the module code on it. So the homepage is pretty self-explanatory, as I said, and most of the information is up there. So the assignment details we're going to cover, and support structure. As I said, even though it's an online module, I hope we will have the opportunity to either have a telephone conversation or a email conversation on a one-to-one basis, so that you can access any support that you need if you are unsure or you've missed anything or you've been unable to access the live broadcast and so on. So please do email me, and hopefully we will be able to resolve any questions or problems that come up. So the assignment is the, apologies, just a few technical things here. The recording will be available once it's up on the DLE. It'll be there until I delete it, I suppose. Okay, so it won't go away. It certainly will be there for the duration of the module. Okay. So the assignment is a critical review of the literature. It's to be submitted on the 12th of January and an electronic submission. And on the Moodle site there is a guide and a link to click to tell you how to upload your assignment when the time comes. Feedback from the assignment will be approximately 4 weeks later, which comes out to be the 16th, I think, of February. Yes, so yes, assignment submission on Monday the 12th of January, and it's an electronic submission. Any questions on that? So it's a critical review of the literature. Are you all aware of what that actually means? I'm quiet in cyberspace now. Well, a critical review of the literature, one of the key points about picking this assignment is you've got to pick your subject area, and all of you work in very different and very diverse environments and incredibly different roles. So pick a subject that's close to your heart. Pick something that you are interested in, because if you are interested in it and it sparks your interest, then you will be able to really get your teeth into it. If it's something that bores you to tears now, you are going to hate it over Christmas and therefore find it very, very difficult to write. What I'm asking for this assignment is a traditional or narrative review. Do you understand what that term means? Anybody? Anybody got any ideas what a traditional or narrative review might mean? Just pausing for some answers to come through. Do I mean it's written in the third person? Yes, it's definitely written in the third person, but that isn't really what I mean by a narrative review or a traditional review. Is it factual? Yes, it's based on the literature that's out there, but it differs in type to a systematic review. So if you have in your idea so if you have an idea of what a systematic review, then you might be clearer about what a narrative review is. Some of you are coming with not using statistics, a summary of the literature available. Yes, in a way, you're absolutely right. We're not going to do a statistical analysis on the literature. What we're not going to do is use something of your own interpretation. And yes, it is a summary of the literature available. But it's a little bit more than that. If we look at what a critical review is, I'm sorry, I skipped through twice. There we go. It's an objective, thorough summary and critical analysis of the relevant available literature and non-research literature on a topic being studied. So what I mean by that is that you have spent quite a lot of time reading what is available out there and all the information that you have around your subject area, and you have decided to critically evaluate certain pieces of work, whether it be research evidence or non-research evidence, to ensure that you have got a clear and accurate picture of what is known on a subject area. And the goal is to bring the reader up to date with the current literature on a topic and form a basis for another goal. And what we're aiming for here is we are aiming for this literature review to finish with a research question or research statement that we can take forward into the next module and develop a research proposal. And one thing when we were developing the research modules for this master's program we were very clear about is that we didn't want to do assignment for assignment's sake. That this was very much, this is the start of your dissertation journey right now. It's not something that can sit alone. So the purpose of this critical review is very much the first chapter of your dissertation for next year. So we're very much trying to build on what you know on a subject area. So we're going to do a critical review, an objective, thorough summary of the literature first. And a good literature review gathers information about a particular subject area and many sources. So if you are looking at a particular subject areas that's very policy driven, you're going to be reviewing the policies as well as any research evidence, as well as any commentary or any other non-research literature, to actually bring yourself to a conclusion about what is known about a subject area. So that when we finish, we have a beautifully phrased and beautifully thought out research question. And that's what we take forward into the next module. So we want something that contains very few biases. So going back to somebody's statement, it's not based on opinion. We don't want personal biases. We want it to have a clear search strategy and selection strategy, so that you've gone through the literature, you've searched the literature in a systematic way, and it's well structured in terms of flow. Uses accurate terminology, and jargon should be kept to a minimum. And referencing is absolutely key for this, because this is very much your opportunity to show off what you know about your subject area before you move forward into a research proposal. Any questions so far? No? So this is a traditional or narrative literature review, and so if you look at the yes, you do need to state your search terms, and when we look at the structure of the assignment in more detail, you will start off, and if you look at good literature reviews, they very much do state their search terms in a small paragraph about your search strategy and how you went about gathering your literature for discussion. So hopefully that answers your question. You won't be given an example to read from past students because this module hasn't existed before. There are many examples of good literature reviews, good narrative literature reviews, and you can search them through Primo and find a number of excellent ones. I will put up an example of a good thematic or narrative literature review on the DLE over the next couple of days. I might have to put the link in the electronic reading list because we're not allowed to put PDFs on the DLE. I'll get told off by my subject librarian. So it's a narrative literature review, and it summarises, critiques and summarises a body of literature and draws conclusions about the topic area in question. And this type of review is useful in gathering together. And as I said, this very much forms the basis for your research proposals for the next module. As I said before, the purpose, or the primary purpose, is to provide the reader with a comprehensive background for understanding current knowledge and highlight the significance of new research. It should identify gaps or inconsistency in the body of knowledge, and it helps the researcher determine or define a research question or hypothesis. And it also is helpful in developing a conceptual or theoretical framework. So one of the key purposes of a literature review in general and this literature review is that you your conclusion of this piece of work should be a research question or a research hypothesis, taking you forward into what you're going to research next year. Oops. So I'm having a few technical problems here. So step one of the process is to select a review topic, and hopefully all of you out there have got a very clear idea of what you're going to be researching. You might even at this stage have a specific research question in mind, and if that's the case, think about it and how you are going to search that particular subject area. So does anybody have a subject already that they are going to be researching next year? Or do they have an idea of what they would like to research? And would you like to tell me what it is? Some ideas. Some people have got some ideas. Anybody got any specific ideas? Planned admissions in the elderly. Okay, that's one idea that's come through. Anything else? Okay, so we've got some ideas. Prenatal attitudes, we've got some unplanned admissions in the elderly, avoiding hospital admissions. So all of those, well, two of those certainly have got large evidence bases already. So your research, your searching of the literature is going to have to be very, very refined. If you have got a subject that is enormously well published, you are going to have to think very carefully about how you filter your literature and decide what you are going to critically evaluate for your study, for your critical review of the literature. Because if you, for example, looking at unplanned admissions for the elderly, if you search that as a particular example, you could get 20,000 research hits. So you've got to start thinking very clearly about what exactly about that topic area you want to take forward. So you select your review topic and then you start searching the literature. You start gathering, reading and analysing the literature. That's step 3. And I cannot emphasise enough how important it is to start quite broadly and to start reading. There's one particular research example that somebody sent in, which is prenatal attitudes. That you might find is a very refined research area, and there may be a limited amount of research in broad terms at this particular moment. So you might want to look at prenatal attitudes globally before refining it down to a specific condition or a specific abnormality. And there is no quick way to do this. There is no quick way to synthesize the literature. It's starting to gather it, examine it, read it, analyze it, and form an opinion of the literature. Because once you get to step 4, you've done 90% of the groundwork, and your assignment is more or less done. But steps 1, 2 and 3 could take ages. So I cannot advocate enough how important it is to start as soon as you possibly can, just so you are in a position to write the review when you need to. So sometimes it might be a case of starting broad and refining your research terms down, or starting wide and narrowing it. So depending on your subject area will depend whether you've got to start broad or you've got to start refined. You cannot start searching 20,000 hits, so you need to find a subject area that you can have a limited amount of research, have a precise amount of research, not limited, precise amount of research to read. And it's really, really important that you start reading as soon as possible. So that is a brief overview of what the assignment is going to be about, and obviously you have got your session next week, not next week, in a fortnight's time with Heather, when she's going to be going into far more detail about the critical review of the literature and the skills of critical review. So in terms of the assignment, the handbook, the plan, and the timetable and the tutorial support side of things, does anybody have any questions? No, all clear as custard, as they say. How many words is the literature review? The literature review is 3,000 words. As it states in the handbook, it's a 3,000 word assignment. Yes, of course you can email me any suggestions or any ideas, and and if you want to talk through any ideas that you might have in a telephone conversation, then drop me a line with a number and a convenient time to call. In terms of recorded sessions available, there is an enormous amount on the university website about critical review, critical analysis, search strategies, and so on. There's an enormous amount of help in the university for writing at master's level and so on. So if there's any assistance that you want, or any tutorial support, learning development support that you'd like, then please let me know, or search the DLE. There are links and webcasts and all sorts of things for you to look at and access over and above the basic module handbook and so on. Hopefully that answers. Any other questions? Okay. So that covers the introduction to the module and the first part of the session. We're now going to move on to the research side. So I'm going to briefly stop the recording and restart with the other presentation. So I'll be back in a moment. Okay, well, we're back and we're going to be talking about research now. So I asked a little while ago whether how you rated your research knowledge, whether you rated your research knowledge from 1 to 10, and some of you were 0 and some of you were 5 or 6. So that's a good indication of where we are in terms of our research knowledge. Please do come in with any questions if I say anything that you're not particularly sure of, or you didn't quite understand as we go along. Try and make this session, as I said, as interactive as possible. We're just going to have a brief overview of research and research knowledge. Now, you said at the beginning, some of you said that your research knowledge was a 1 or a 2, and some of you said it was a 5 or a 6. And so I'm going to start at the very beginning, and I'm not going to break into song, but I am going to start at the beginning, and we're going to build from there, so that hopefully we're all on the same page. If you look at the reading list, there are a number of introductory texts that I've mentioned. One of them is Making Sense of Research. It's a book, a very small book by Muhlenbeck, which is called An Introduction, Making Sense of Research, An Introduction for Health and Social Care Practitioners. It is a very easy read. And if you are at this stage very unsure of your research knowledge, or feel that your research knowledge just needs a bit of revision, or you just need to think, get back into the research terminology, it's a great place to start. I would say it's very much undergraduate level. It's very much a level 6 book, if not slightly lower than level 6, but certainly if it was, I was coming back to research, having been away from it for a long time, or if I was unsure of my research knowledge, it would be a great place to start. It's also quite thin and quite cheap, so you can start there. Building on that, it's really important at this stage to find a research text that you like, and I'm not going to say go and buy X or go and buy Y, because I think what is so important at this stage is for you to find a research textbook that fits you and works well for you. There are many research textbooks out there that give you a really good overview of all the research methodologies and the key themes and key paradigms. I would suggest at this stage that you have a look at a few and find one that fits you best. When I did my research masters, we were all told to go and buy Pollitt and Hungler, which is on the reading list. And I picked it up and I read the first few pages and I thought, oh my goodness me, this is horrible. I don't understand a word. And our first research lecture was given by a research professor who, as far as I was concerned, was talking a foreign language. So hopefully we won't go down that path, and hopefully by the end of this session you won't be feeling like I'm talking in a foreign language. But one of the things that I did say at the beginning is that research and research terms are a language of their own, and if you get to know the terms and feel comfortable with the language, then research is nothing to be even worried about. So at the end, we're going to hopefully understand what the research process is and understand the principles of the research process and what we mean by research as opposed to evidence and non-research literature and non-research evidence, and that we've had a quick overview and had a brief understanding of the different research paradigms, and hopefully that's okay for this afternoon. Somebody's asked if we're going to be going until 4 o'clock. That rather depends on you and how many questions you ask. We'll go until we're finished, really, but I wouldn't have thought it will go on until 4. Any questions at this stage? No, you seem to have all disappeared. Hopefully you're all still listening. Right. So let's have a quick look at what we mean by research and research evidence. I quite like this quote. I like this quote because even though it's very, very old now, it talks about evidence-based practice, and we've been talking about evidence-based practice probably for the last 30 years now. Certainly long before I started my nursing career and my nursing research career. Defined as a conscientious, explicit and judicious use of current best evidence in making decisions about the care of individual patients. So what we're talking about here is evidence. And we all do this, don't we? We all absolutely deliver the care out there in practice using the best evidence available. So now it's about our ability to sift through and work out what best evidence is meant. So how do we achieve the best evidence-based practice? We ask the right questions, we find the best evidence, we critically appraise that evidence, we act on that evidence, and we appraise our performance or your performance. And this really is mimicking what I'm asking you to do in terms of your research assignment, and the fact that I'm asking you to ask a question, find the best evidence out there, and critically appraise that evidence. And in practice, you're then going to act on that evidence, and then you're going to review. Sorry, there's a technical question come through. I'm not sure how to adjust at this end. The presentation is available as a PowerPoint on the DLE, and if you can't access it, Rebecca, I will email it later to you. Hopefully that's... So that's what we mean by evidence-based practice and reviewing the best evidence. Well, let's look at the research process and the research process in terms of your research proposal and in terms of the research that you're going to read out there. The research process is about asking the right question. So all of you have got a question in your mind or a topic in your mind. You're going to search the evidence, search the literature. And when we say search the literature, we mean the research-based literature as well as the non-research-based literature. And you understand, hopefully all of you understand exactly what I mean by the research-based literature and the non-research-based literature. So the non-research-based literature is going to be things like policies and anecdotal evidence and commentary, as well as the research-based literature, which is pure qualitative or quantitative research. So we search it, we review it, and we prepare a research proposal. We've then got to ask a specific question of a specific group of people, and therefore we have to access them and sample them. And this is about our research design. So when we get into the next module and we start developing our research proposal, we're going to be very much concerned with our access, our sampling, our research design, our data collection, our data analysis. And then you are, in terms of the next year when you're doing your dissertation, you're going to be reporting and disseminating this research. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about the research process. So what do we mean by research as opposed to literature, as opposed to evidence? And the definition of the research, again, this is a very old quote from MacLeod, Clark and Hockney, which comes from one of the research textbooks that I've cited on the reading list, which is Nursing Research Principles and Processes and Issues, which is the Keda Parahu book. And they define research as an attempt to increase the sum of what is known, usually referred to as the body of knowledge, by the discovery of new facts or relationships through a process of systematic scientific inquiry. And there's some key words there that really allude to what we mean by research and research-based evidence, and that's systematic scientific inquiry. But research has to go through a specific process. To be research, rather than audit, rather than anecdotal evidence, rather than commentary, it has to go through a systematic scientific process of inquiry. And when we talk about paradigms of research, we always are talking about these levels of inquiry. So a definition of nursing research, which if you put this next quote in the social and political context in which it was given, so we're talking about 1994, that describes nursing research as providing the links between practice, education and theory, thereby making it essential for all nurses to be knowledgeable doers or research doers. And there's a very interesting tripartite relationship to discuss there about practice, education and theory. And I'm sure you are all very, very aware of what we refer to as the theory-practice gap. There's been multitudes of research about the theory-practice gap, and I'm sure all of you could think of a specific example in your own personal practice or knowledge where you think, that's what the research says we do, that's what the theoretical paradigm says we should do, but this is what we actually do. And why is that? Why is that we do not necessarily do what the research evidence suggests we should, or the theoretical evidence suggests we should? And that's a question that many have asked and few people have fully answered. And there is an enormous amount of research out there about the theory-practice gap. So slightly more relevant or recent is a quote from Cormack, which comes from the textbook that I've cited on the reading list. And he talks about the purpose of nursing research was to establish scientifically defensible reasons for nursing activities, which is an interesting purpose, that we need to be defensible in our actions. To provide nurses with an increased repertoire of scientifically defensible nursing intervention options, to find a way of increasing the cost effectiveness of nursing activities, to provide a basis for standard setting and quality, to provide evidence of weakness, to satisfy academic curiosity, quite like that one, to facilitate interdisciplinary collaborations in nursing and nursing research, and to earn and defend a professional status for nursing. I'm very aware of the fact that not everybody that's listening today is actually a nurse, but I think that's just as relevant to all healthcare practitioners. And so the fact that it says nursing there is not necessarily relevant. But it's looking about key themes of the purpose of nursing research and the purpose of research in general. It's looking about developing a quality product. So now we'll get on to talking about nursing, or talking about research paradigms. Hopefully all of you have heard the phrase research paradigms before. Have you? Am I making an assumption there? Yes, you have. Great. Well, some of you have. So a paradigm is a perspective or a viewpoint adopted. So it's a particular term that we use quite often in research terms as to explain the viewpoint or the perspective. So we talk about qualitative or quantitative paradigms. And I'm absolutely positive that all of you have heard of quantitative or qualitative research paradigms. I'm really hoping that you've all heard those terms before. Yep, great. Some yeses, some people just aren't responding. Great. So we're talking about qualitative or quantitative paradigms for research. So we talk about the two paradigms. We talk about quantitative research, and quantitative research being deductive. We're testing a hypothesis. When we're talking about a quantitative research paradigm, we are looking at a specific question, a specific perspective. We are trying to analyse a question or statement in a quantitative, deductive manner. Whereas if we are looking at it from a qualitative perspective, we are looking at it from an inductive perspective. We're not looking to test a hypothesis to prove something is right or wrong, accurate or not. We are looking to advance theory. So qualitative research is asking a different question. So with quantitative research, we're looking at reason, understanding subjectivity. Sorry, other way around. That's a bit confusing, that slide, isn't it? It should say qualitative on one side and quantitative on the other. So if we are looking at words, reason, understanding and subjectivity. We are looking at it from a qualitative perspective. Whereas if we are looking from a quantitative perspective, we are looking at numbers. We are looking for cause. We are looking to explain something in a rational manner, and we are looking to be objective. Any questions so far? No? I'm not sure I understand that question. Typo, okay. Just going to retype there. No, not coming back with another question. Qualitative feels more. Yes, a literature review can be either, but when we're talking about qualitative research or quantitative research, we're talking about asking a different question and asking it from a different perspective. So if you are asking a quantitative question, you are, as I said before, looking to cause and effect. You're looking to explain something and you're going to be objective. And I've put numbers in inverted commas because the idea is with quantitative research you are often looking at numbers and measurements. And in terms of a literature review, we may do a quantitative literature review which might form a systematic review. So we are going to reanalyze statistics in terms of our revised research question. And that's what a systematic review is. Where a qualitative research is looking at it from a more subjective manner. It's looking to investigate something and understand it and seek to explain something with words usually, and we're talking about thematic analysis then. And it tends to be more subjective and it can feel much more like a narrative literature review. So in a way, what I'm asking you to do in terms of your assignment is perform a qualitative literature review. So do a thematic analysis of the literature out there. Whereas if you did a systematic review for your dissertation, you would be asking a specific research question and reanalyzing the data in terms of your statistical analysis. Can you use either types in your review or your evidence base? Yeah, absolutely. If you, in terms of your critical review of the literature, I would hope that you would have a number of quantitative studies and a number of qualitative studies. I'm not going to definitively say you need 10 of one and 10 of the other, because it might be that your subject area very much lends itself to being a subject area that's covered by a lot of qualitative research, or a subject area that might be covered by a lot of quantitative research. But the hope is that if you are looking at a broad analysis of the literature, that you would have both qualitative and quantitative research. So if I talk about the subject area of, trying to think of a specific, hand washing, let's be really, really basic here. If I looked at the, if I did a literature review about hand washing, I might want to see some quantitative studies that had done a very systematic, objective measurement of infection rates following specific hand washing techniques. I also might want to look at the literature surrounding some of the political, role modelling, performance-related attitudes towards hand washing. So if I was looking at hand washing as a global subject, I might want to come at it from 2 or more perspectives. Good research skills, able to analyse both. Absolutely, but when we go on in a minute to talk about ontology and epistemology, one thing that we need to understand about research terms is that we need to analyse what perspective the researcher is coming from and what their attitudes to subjects and reality is, and we'll come on to that in a minute when we talk about ontology. If we use a topic, no, absolutely not, and that's the whole point. Sorry, to address a specific question that's come from, if we use a topic for our research dissertation for this assignment, will we need to do a different literature review from the dissertation? No, absolutely not. That's what I'm saying when I say assignments for assignment's sake. This assignment, this particular literature review, although you may develop it and you may tweak it to go into your final dissertation, this is chapter 2 of your dissertation that you are writing now. So you do not have to repeat the process. You might add to it because, of course, you will have done more work and you may want to improve it and change it in reflection to the feedback that you're given on this assignment. But no, this is a building block of your dissertation for next year. So in fact, you know, we're starting our dissertation today. So don't think of it as separate entities. This is all one entity. So I'm not making you do twice as much work. And Jenny, who runs the dissertation module, and I were very clear on that. We did not want you to have to do it all twice. So we talk about levels or theoretical foundations when we talk about research, and we talk about ontology, epistemology, methodology, and method. Now we're getting on to the great words, aren't we? So think of it as sort of layers of a particular research foundations. So the bottom layer is your method, the next layer is your methodology, the next layer is your epistemology, and the next layer is your ontology. So my ontology, if I am an interpretive or qualitative researcher, oops, sorry, my ontology, my ontology, if I am a qualitative researcher, is how I view the world and how I view reality. So if I am an interpretive researcher, I view reality as being mentally and socially constructed and culturally biased, and multiple realities and interpretations exist. And what I mean by that is that I do not believe that facts are facts, that there is one way of thinking about a particular idea or not, that depending on where you come from and who you are and what you think about the world will depend on how you view a particular problem. So you might, every single one of you comes to this session, or comes to any session, or comes to any particular research question with different knowledge and different ways of thinking and different social and cultural ideas. And so if you are an interpretive or qualitative researcher, you appreciate that multiple realities exist and that any situation can be interpreted in a multiple sort of ways, and that doesn't make you right or wrong. On the other side of the coin, or the other side of the, or other perspective, if you are a positive researcher, so a quantitative researcher, you view reality as being objective. It exists independently of perception and it's driven by natural law. So facts are facts, and I can prove them, and that's a particular way of thinking. And if you think about people generally, you might think that some people fall in one category or the other. So you might think to yourself, if you work in intensive care, and my personal background is in intensive care, and I always thought that because I worked in intensive care, that I would come to research and my ontology would be very positivist, because in ITU often it is very factual and figure orientated, and it's quite sometimes can be black or white. But all the research that I have ever done has been interpretive. I've always been an interpretive researcher, because I firmly believe that the facts are always dependent on perception. So depending on the research question that you choose and the research topic that you decide to examine, it might lead you in a particular way and ask a particular question and come at it from a particular approach. But I would challenge you to suggest that you as a person will influence the way that question is asked. And that's because of your ontology or your view of the world. Any questions on that? No? Okay, so we'll move on to epistemology here now. So epistemology really refers, in terms of the interpretive researcher, it refers to knowledge is constructed in a social and historical context. Findings represent a creation of the process between the researcher and the subject, or research and the subject, and truth is pragmatic, or based on pragmatic criteria. So an interpretive researcher looks at the relationship between the researcher and their subject, and the process of collecting the information may form some of the information that you're analysing. So it's about being in and immersed in a particular research environment, and that you are not suggesting, if you are an interpretive researcher, that you have got to stand and view, that you may be involved, and it's about being realistic and based on reality. And an awful lot of real-world research is interpretive. Whereas if you are a positivist, and you are looking at it as a quantitative researcher, you adopt an objective and detached stance. And true belief corresponds to fact. So you stand away from the subjects, you observe, you do not become involved, and there is a degree of distance between you and the subject, so that you can maintain a completely objective stance. And truly positivist researchers, their epistemology corresponds to extreme distance. So you would test subjects rather than inquire and investigate subjects. Have you got any questions on that? One of the huge disadvantages of being distance learning is I can't see your faces. So I have no way of knowing whether you are with me or not. No questions? Yes, funding definitely does lend itself to a positivist approach. And that's where, in many ways, health service research feels sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Yeah. I know what you're saying in the fact that drug companies and people, other institutions and other interested parties, they want facts. They want something to be proved. They want something to be established as a cause and effect. So we're going, very much down the sort of drug trial route of, if I do X to you, will Y happen? And if that's the case, then whatever it is worth investing in. But I think there has been a shift, certainly in the last 10 years, to the interpretive perspective, in the fact that there is more value shown to what something is going to feel like and what something is going to, how the experience is going to influence you and how the experience is going to develop. So yes, funding does seem to follow the positivist stance, but hopefully that's changing. Absolutely, there will often be conflict, and one of the luxuries, I suppose, that you will feel as a academic researcher, i.e. that you are doing your research for an academic award and academic purposes, you have the luxury of being able to say, no, I don't need to prove X, or I don't need to go down Y's route. You do not have to be influenced by the agenda that's in your workplace to be pushed into a piece of research that you don't necessarily want to do. I'm not suggesting in real life that that isn't the case, and that there won't be managers out there that say to you, this needs to be established, this needs to be investigated, so please do X, do Y, and that pressures won't come to bear on you to establish something that you're not necessarily interested in. But this is where, in a way, you can be a petulant child and say, no, my master's is my master's and I'll research what I want to do. When it comes to getting a grant or research grant and research funding, then it's going to be a very difficult or different question. And from personal experience doing my PhD, I know that there are many people invested in what I'm researching, and therefore there are many people who wish me to ask specific questions in specific ways. And sometimes it is quite difficult when you do a solo piece of research to remain uninfluenced. When you do a joint study, or you find yourself as part of a team researching a particular idea or subject area, then obviously influences come to play. But you have to think about where you are coming from and how you look at the world and what you want to investigate and what questions you want answered. And be very clear in your own mind about what type of person or type of researcher you are or want to be, and what you feel that you will be able to investigate. Because I think if you try and ask a question that conflicts the way you think of the world, then you'll find it very, very difficult to answer it, whether it be from a qualitative or a quantitative perspective. So we have our ontology, which is our way of viewing the world. We have our epistemology, which is where we sit in relationship to that question and the subjects that we're going to be asking. And then we move on to the methodology. And the methodology is the way in which we are going to answer that question. So if we look at it from a methodological perspective, if we are an interpretive, we are looking at hermeneutics. That's a great word, isn't it? Dialectic. We focus on uncovering a variety of constructions that exist. So we're looking at language and we're looking at the way things are answered. What language is used when we answer them? And we look at it from an interpretive perspective. So our methodology is going to be very much looking at the way words are used and the way language is used. Yes, excellent for Scrabble. Although you've got to have quite a lot of space to get hermeneutic in there. But if we look at language and we look at an interpretive methodology, that very much leads us to the method of data collection. So this is where, when you're developing your research proposal or you're looking at the research that's out there, you can see where the methodology and the method have sat together well. So if I was looking at a particular research question, and my ontology was that multiple realities exist, and my epistemology was that I wanted to be involved in a relationship with the researcher and the subject, and I wanted to look at it from a hermeneutic and dialectic perspective, what method of data collection do you think would lend itself to those ways of thinking? Absolutely. Absolutely. You are looking at it from an interviewing, qualitative perspective, that you are going to sit in a relationship with somebody and you are more than likely going to interview them. And that interview may take the form of a semi-structured interview, it may take the form of a structured interview, it may take the form of a focus group interview, but the whole idea of this methodology is that you are looking to immerse yourself and investigate the particular question from a perspective that is interpretive. And therefore, you are going to be seeking to investigate it in a specific way. So an interview, focus group interview, also an observation, but it would possibly be a participant observation, i.e. you are in there observing with the subject. So if you wanted to, going back to my hand washing analogy, you wanted to interview people, do a focus group about hand washing, but also you might go and work on the ward and observe people and wash hands next to somebody. Now, we're not going to talk at the moment about what sort of ethical issues might come to play if we were doing that, but it would be about immersing ourselves in a particular environment and understanding the environment in which we work. Yes, we could use a questionnaire, but we would be looking at it from a non-structured, so sort of an open-ended question, i.e. how do you feel, and with open questions, not quantitative questions where we would measure or score or something like that. So we could use a questionnaire, but it would be an open-ended questions. So very much lending itself to that those types of method. So on the other side of the coin, if we are coming at it from a positivist perspective, and we are looking at it from a controlled testing hypothesis experimental design, what methods of data collection do you think we might employ in this particular perspective? Any other ideas on methods of data collection? We've got some ideas. We've got audit as one. I'll come back to audit later. Numbers, definitely. Surveys, experiments, closed questionnaires, absolutely. We're looking at it from a much more structured, much more rigid, much more, not limited, that's the wrong word to use, but much more defined perspective, i.e. we would be sending a questionnaire. We don't want to see them. We won't necessarily observe them. We could do some non-participant observations, so we could sit back and view. We could do an experiment, so a test. And I'm sure all of you have heard the term a randomized controlled trial. I'm sure you've all heard that phrase before. Hopefully some of you are going to say yes, you have. A randomized controlled trial, as we talk about, is the gold standard. We love that phrase in research. The gold standard of positivist method of data collection. And that's all a randomized controlled trial is. It's a method of data collection, but it sits very much with the positivist paradigm. It sits over there with experimental controlled, and it's testing a hypothesis. And typically when we use the randomized controlled trial, we have a very structured environment of which we are testing and specific questions that we are examining. So the methods of data collection very much follow what side or what perspective we're coming from. So if you think about a recent piece of research that you may have read, hopefully you will be able to view it now and think to yourself, where was this researcher? Where was their ontology? Where was their epistemology? Where was their methodology? Where was their method? And be able to interpret that research, looking at it and thinking, was this an interpretive piece of research? Was this a positivist piece of research? And how did it fit? So when we look at critiquing research, we might look at a piece of research and we might say, well, the question that they asked, so how does it feel to wash our hands? And they did a randomized control trial to look at infection rates. We've got a research question and that doesn't fit our method of data collection. So if we looked at the research and researcher's question, i.e. how does it feel to wash our hands, we can't answer that question from a quantitative paradigm. We need to go down a qualitative paradigm to answer that question. And some of the research that you will look at out there, you might think and you might view it and say, did they pick the right method of data collection, right approach, right research design to answer the question that they stated that they were going to ask? And that can sometimes be a criticism. Any questions so far? Okay, great. Let's move forward a little bit and go into a bit more detail about qualitative research. Okay. So qualitative research, it asks questions such as to explore, to examine, to investigate. The language that's used in qualitative research is quite specific, and it should allude to exactly the approach that's being taken. So if we identify the research question or research statement at the beginning of the piece of research that we're reading, we should be able to identify very quickly whether it is a qualitative or quantitative piece of research, or whether it is what perspective or what paradigm it comes from. So the kind of research designs that we will be examining in qualitative research are there's a couple of examples here. So we might talk about ethnographic research, we might talk about phenomenological research, and we might talk about grounded theory. Have you heard any of those terms before? We've got yes, no, and maybe, which is, okay. So let's have a little look. I mean, let's have a little look at some of these perspectives to begin with. So we look at ethnographic research to start with. So ethnographic research. Ethnographic research is typically research that looks at understanding human behaviour in a cultural and social context in which it takes place. So if our research design and our methodology is an ethnographic research design, then we will often use methods such as observation and interview. Because if we are looking to understand human behaviour in the social context that it takes place, then we want to see the people in their native environment, for want of a better expression. So if we were doing a piece of ethnographic research, what we might do is we might observe people. And there's been an awful lot of ethnographic research about the practice area and how new students socialise themselves to the particular environment, or how nurses or midwives prepare themselves for going into the practice environment, and some of the research that's been done about how behaviour changes. So we might look at student nurses and we might say, if they're sitting in a lecture theatre in their jeans and they're chewing gum and they're sitting there texting, that they're not going to behave like that when they go into the practice environment. Hopefully they're not. And that they adopt a particular way of behaving because of where they are and what they're going to do. We've also done an awful lot of research about becoming the professional patient, and I'm sure some of you are aware of it, how people relinquish the responsibilities to make any kind of decisions about what they're going to eat and when they're going to eat because they've gone into hospital. And suddenly they're a 50-year-old person who's normally up and about and on the golf course, and suddenly they're in their pyjamas because they're in hospital. So they're in their pyjamas and they're sitting on a bed. And so ethnographic research looks at understanding this behaviour. Absolutely. It's about investigating why people behave or why people do certain things in certain environments. Why do we behave in a certain way because of the social or environmental context that we're in? So why do people do what they do? Why do we behave differently when we go to a certain place? And those of you out there who are mums as well as professionals as well as wives, you might look at it from a sociological perspective, and you might think the way you behave when you're at home and the way you behave when you're at work and the way you behave today because you are being a student, inverted commas, is different. And why is that? Why are you suddenly behaving in a different manner because of what you are doing? And ethnographic research very much looks at it from that perspective. So the best way to answer that question, the best way to discover why people do what they do, is to either observe them, so that would be participant or non-participant observation, or we might seek to interview them. We could send them a questionnaire as well, but you might say that you'd get much better or richer data if you actually sat down and physically asked them the questions. Okay, so an ethnographic study is very much looking at the cultural perspective of people. Any questions on that? No? One of the books I've mentioned before is the Keda Parahu book, which is Nursing Research Principles, Process and Issues. And one of the really nice things about this particular textbook is that it gives you some great working examples of different types of research. And they've got a nice research examples about an ethnographic study and a phenomenological study and a grounded theory study. And the ethnographic study that they cite is about seeking understanding of the learning experience of district nurses in the learning environment of the community and to examine learning in the practice setting from the perspective of the student. So this particular research examines how district nursing students behaved when they went out into the community over the course of their programme. So that's quite a good example, and how they went about it. Any questions on ethnography? Move on to phenomenological approach or phenomenology. The research that I've done most recently has been phenomenological research, and whenever I mention phenomenological research, my husband thinks it's really, really funny to go da 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 da. He's not anything to do with education, so he still thinks it's hilarious. But phenomenological research is interested in how respondents give meaning to their experience and how they perceive the world. It's a very, very specific type of research. And often when we talk about phenomenological research, we talk about the lived experience. And one of the key aspects of phenomenological research is, as a methodology and a study design, is we're very much interested in how the respondents give meaning to what's happened to them. It doesn't matter what we think it might feel like to do X or Y. It's about what they thought. And so most typically, in a phenomenological study, it will be an in-depth interview. That's the best way of finding out how people think about a particular perspective. So if you wanted to do a piece of phenomenological research about how it feels to be a master's student, what would be the best way of finding out? The best way would be to ask the question, how does it feel to be a master's student, to master's students, and let those master's students actually tell you. So let them tell their story. So typically, what you're going to be given is a long, in-depth discussion of a particular subject area. And one of the challenges when doing phenomenological interviewing is that you have to allow your subjects to talk. And they may talk and talk and talk. The key to being a good researcher would be to keep them on topic and maybe have some prompts and key cues to bring them back on topic so that you are actually getting them to answer the question that you are asking them. But one of the challenges is the analysis that then has to take place and how you look at it from many different perspectives, looking for themes and different content and different language. So you might do an interpretive phenomenological study, which looks at how people interpret certain experiences. You might do a hermeneutic phenomenological study, which might look at specific language that reoccurs. But no, you will not be using enormously structured questions. You will be using open-ended questions that allow your research subjects to talk, and sometimes talk and talk and talk. because the richest data often appears at the end of the interview when the person talking has become incredibly comfortable. So you have to allow your subjects to tell their story in their own words. And it can be quite a challenging approach. But typically it's an open-ended, unstructured interview. It doesn't mean that you can't collect phenomenological information through other means, but the best way of asking a phenomenological question is to allow your subjects to talk. Any questions on phenomenology? No? Would you need an understanding of behaviour to use ethnography? No, not necessarily. If you're coming at a question from an ethnographic perspective, you may want a limited knowledge of the setting. For example, if you wanted to see how, to go back to the example that's used in the Keda Parahu book, about learning experiences of district nurses, who would be the best person to investigate learning experiences of district nurses? Well, the best person would be a district nurse, because she would be able to view the world from the same perspective as the subjects that she's researching. But that doesn't mean she would have to. She would have to have a knowledge of district nursing. So she might be a psychiatrist or a psychologist, an anthropologist, anybody that's inquiring about human behaviour. She doesn't have to be. So you don't have to be a nurse to do ethnographic research on nurses. You don't have to be a midwife to do ethnographic research on midwives. But some knowledge of the environment in which you're going in is useful. So hopefully that answers your question. Grounded theory is sort of a combination of the last two. It sort of shares values from ethnography and phenomenology, because it's the study of the viewpoint from the respondent, but it relies on data to form the theory. What does that mean? Any ideas? What do I mean by that? Has anybody read any grounded theory work? I got deathly silence from the audience. Nobody done any grounded theory work or come across any grounded theory work? No? Yes, in a way, there's a couple of responses that have come through. It is about emerging data. I would say in genetics, grounded theory may be in the fact that you might be examining it from a specific perspective, but I would suggest that grounded theory is about researching something from the phenomenon of the responder. So therefore you are immersed in it and you are relying on what people are saying or what the subjects are saying to inform your theoretical perspective. So as part of your research process, you are asking questions about a specific idea. An example would be, and this is the example taken from the Khedr-Parahu, is that the main purpose of the grounded theory approach is to generate concepts from the data in order to formulate a model or a conceptual framework or a theory. In this particular study, they examined what it was like to have ulcerative colitis from the perspective of the teenagers. So they asked teenagers with ulcerative colitis what it was like to have that. They had no preconceived idea or preconceived theory about what living with ulcerative colitis was going to be like. So can we translate that into a gene discovery scenario? I don't think we can, because gene discovery is very much coming from experimental perspective. In grounded theory, you use a process of constant comparative analysis and constant comparative methods to constantly review and refer back to the data that you've collected. So whereas in a randomized control trial or some experiment, you might say, I am going to ask 10,000 people X question. In grounded theory, you're going to say, I'm going to ask as many people as it takes to answer the question that I've asked. So in terms of a research proposal, it can be very challenging because you are asking an ethics committee often, if you are going to actually do a grounded theory study, to say, I don't know how many people I need to ask, and I'm not really sure what I'm going to ask them. I'm going to start off by asking them questions about this, because this is what the literature says is an important issue. But the data may take me in a different avenue. So I will discover theory and generate ideas as I go along. Now, you have to be quite brave to take a grounded theory approach at this level, because it is quite difficult to define it. And yes, you're absolutely right, you are looking for common themes and common theoretical constructs in a particular type of inquiry. So going back to the example from the Khedr-Parahu book, you are looking at generating a model of what it is like to have a certain disease from the perspective of the people who have that disease, with the hope that you could then prepare others who get diagnosed with ulcerative colitis. So the purpose of this particular study was to prepare maybe an information book or a self-help type tape for people who had been newly diagnosed, because they had collected this data to inform them of what it was actually like to have a specific disease. So in grounded theory, you are basically investigating and relying on data to answer your questions. Whereas in a phenomenological study or an ethnographic study, if we're talking about qualitative research, you are very much, they've got a predetermined question or statement that they are going to investigate. So the methods of data collection in grounded theory can be quite broad. They can be a questionnaire, they can be an interview, they can be observation, participant, non-participant observation. So the methods of data collection can be quite flexible depending on the information that you might require. That's not a completely exclusive list of all qualitative research design, but it's a summary of the key approaches. Any questions? Key thing about qualitative research is investigating it from a particular perspective. So we go back to our ontology, our epistemology, and we look at the question that we're going to ask and how we view the world and how we're going to answer that question and where we are going to sit in terms of the people that we are researching, or subjects that we are researching. So if we go on to quantitative research, we are asking very, very different questions when we are doing a piece of quantitative research, when our ontology and our epistemology is that of a positivist. We're coming at it from a positivist paradigm. So we tend to be asking ourselves questions such as how much, how many, how often, what percentage, what proportion, what risk. So we are asking very defined and definitive questions about a particular research area. So the research designs that we may use if we're looking at a quantitative research study is we might look at the experimental research design, a quasi-experimental research design, or some sort of intervention. Are we familiar with these terms? Have we heard these terms before? Some of them. Okay, so if we're looking at an experimental design, what do we mean when we say an experiment? What are we thinking? Well, an experiment is a very structured approach. It's an experimental research is a test. It's a quantitative process in which ideas, concepts are tested based on the positivist philosophy. It's gone back to that positivist paradigm. Empirical data is used to explain increased knowledge about a physical world or a phenomenon such as childbirth or illness. So if I'm doing an experiment, I'm going to physically collect data to explain something. I'm going to do an experiment. So if I was being really simplistic, what might be an example of an experiment? If I pour acid onto X, Y will happen. We're looking at it from a very specific quantitative positivist paradigm. If we're looking at it from an experimental perspective, we're going to test something. If I bend this piece of plastic, what angle will it come to before it breaks? You know, a really physical, specific test. There's a problem there, though, isn't there, in the fact that people don't behave, do they? They don't behave like they're meant to. So it would be quite difficult to do a true, proper, honest experiment on people. So what we talk about in health service and health research is we talk about a quasi-experiment. And a quasi-experiment is actually, quasi is false, is Latin for false. So it's a false experiment. And what we mean by that is a quasi-experiment is a sort of experiment. We're going to do absolutely everything we can to make it an experiment, but in real life. Yes? So does that make sense? So a quasi-experiment is what we really do, because we can't actually do what we'd like to do to people. Can you have a... Can you have a positivist questionnaire which produces figures and data which follow quantitative research? Yes, absolutely. And an example of a positivist questionnaire might be the kind of questionnaire, and I'm sure you've filled these in, where, and I know you have, because one of them is a modular evaluation, which we do quantitative research on, which is, they make statements such as, did you find the handbook useful? 1, no, it was rubbish, to 5, yes, it was brilliant. Yeah, and you score it. So have you come across those kind of positivist questionnaires where you have figures? One being I agree, I strongly agree, I neither here nor there, disagree. Yeah. So we call those analog scales, or and they are an absolutely perfect example of how we use a positivist questionnaire to produce a figure. So what you will come out with is a score. So 1 being the handbook was rubbish, to 5 being the handbook was brilliant. And if you sent that to everybody that received a handbook, you would get an overall score. And the bigger the score, the better the handbook. Yeah? That's a nice positivist example of a questionnaire. But going back to experiments, which are specific tests, when we talk about quasi-experiments or experiments, what we are talking about is the key factors that we're looking at are manipulation. So when we look at experiment and when we look at interventions, and these are all typical types of research designs and quantitative studies, we introduce a manipulation. We do something to somebody. So we add a drug, do a different delivery of care, use a different dressing, do something different. And there is a control of the intervention, not of the individual. And the control group we then have, now I'm sure you've all heard of these phrases like control group, where you have a group that you're doing something to and a group that you're not doing something to, and you see who's different. So if, for example, we were evaluating, or we were doing an experiment on a teaching package, and we wanted to see whether it worked. No, actually, I'll use a drug as an example. So you have a painkiller, paracetamol. You've got people all who've got a headache, and you're going to give paracetamol to all of those people to see whether it works. And then you've got a group of people with a headache, and you're not going to give them anything, and you'll see whether their headache goes. What are the problems that can exist in that very simplistic example of an experiment or an intervention trial? Any ideas? You're coming up with all the fantastic examples. Well done, all of you. So yes, firstly, different degrees of pain. So we're going to get a group of people together, and we're going to say you've all got a headache, and it's got to be on a scale from 1 to 5, and I want you all to have a headache that's a 4 or a 5. Yeah? So if we all were asked the same question, we'd all score our degrees of pain differently. So that would be one problem. 2, reaction to the drug. Some people might be very sensitive to a particular drug, and therefore it worked very easily. So we might say that paracetamol is incredibly effective, but also there may be other people that it doesn't work for. So that doesn't, again, it doesn't tell us anything. People might take different doses of the drug. So we'll try with our controls to make sure that we've done exactly the same thing. So we're going to give everybody 1 gram of paracetamol at a particular time, and we're going to measure their pain scores on 15-minute intervals for the next 2 hours to see if we can eliminate as many differentials as possible. Pain is different for everybody. Yes, it is. What pain score are we going to use? Is everybody going to understand that pain score? That's first. And Rachel's come up with a very interesting addition to the factor, is that we can introduce a placebo. So that's where we're getting more complicated, aren't we? So we've got one group of people that are going to have paracetamol, one group of people who are going to have nothing, and we're going to have another group of people that we're just going to give them something. We're not going to tell them what it is, and see whether their headache goes as well. We run into a whole host of problems, and ethics is one of them, but we'll cover ethics in a minute. So yes, we could randomly allocate them all to these different groups. So you could be, so we've gone more complicated, haven't we? We've gone from 2 groups, one with the drug, one without the drug, to 3 groups. One with the drug, one without the drug, and one with something that's not the drug, a placebo. We're going to randomly allocate them to these 3 groups. And in the hope of random allocation is that we're going to have broadly the similar groups in each of our 3 different intervention areas and our control group, to ensure that we've got roughly the same age groups and roughly the same physical attributes. But we run into a whole host of other problems then, in the fact that every single person in that group is an individual. So how can we possibly say that it was X that caused Y? So what we're building here is what we call the gold standard of research design, because this is what we're describing here is absolutely a randomized control trial, isn't it? Where we've got random allocation of participants between the experimental and the control group, but we've got an experimental group that receives the treatment or the intervention or a placebo, and we've got random numbers used for the allocation, and then the outcomes of each of the groups are compared. There are a host of difficulties with a randomized control trial. I mean, we talk about it being the gold standard of quantitative research, but if we look at the flaws in that, if we were just using our headache example and our use of paracetamol, very simplistic example, but it makes the point. So let's try and refine our different groups. So we're going to test this drug on, let's say, 20 to 30-year-olds. Well, what do we mean? So 20 to 30, that's quite a specific age group. Men and women. Are we going to ask for any specific physical or mental conditions? So they've got to have no previous medical history, and they've got to have no psychological problems. So we might have to do some sort of test on them to make sure that they haven't used excessive amounts of drugs in the past, or they might, we're including and excluding an awful lot of people here. So we started off with 20 to 30-year-old men or women, but we can't say that all 20 to 30-year-old men and women are the same. What do they mean by a headache? How do they measure pain? And then, one of you came up with a very, very key point, wouldn't it be unethical to deny painkillers? So we've got a control group who aren't having any painkillers at all, and we've got a placebo group that we're giving a sugar tablet to. And would that be ethical? No, of course it wouldn't. So when we talk about randomized control trials, we're not really being particularly honest necessarily, because we can't really eliminate all the controls. In a pure randomized control trial, all of the people in our study would be exactly the same. Well, that would be physically impossible. So we try and make them as the same as we possibly can. But one of the criticisms of all randomized control trial is that we test a specific drug on a specific group of people. If it's informed consent, is it then ethical? That's a very, very difficult question to answer. And it will very much depend on the ethics committee and the intervention that we're talking about. It would be completely unethical to withhold a life-saving treatment for somebody, however well informed they were. And our research governance legislation would actually prevent us from doing that. Excuse me. We have very clear guidelines about what we can and can't do to people or withhold from people, and therefore whether we tell them or not doesn't necessarily make it ethical. Obviously, there are drug trials that occur, and people are fully informed, and I'm sure you've heard about them in the press, where terrible things have happened because they've been given the drug or not. And so, depending on the ethics committee and the study itself, often those rules can be slightly obfuscated. But one does tend to follow the principles, and I'm sure Ruth, when she does her research ethics session with you and talks about the principles of ethics, will cover in more detail the ideas of beneficence and non-maleficence, and the fact that our code and our professional bodies control what we can and can't do to people, even if they know. So a randomised control trial, we've got random allocation of participants. They're going into an experimental group and a control group. We're going to compare the results. So let's go back to our paracetamol example. We've got one group of people who are having paracetamol. We've got one group of people who are not having anything at all. And we've got one group of people who are having a placebo. And we are going to give them pain scores every 15 minutes and to see how quickly a pain score goes from 1 being no pain, 5 being excruciating pain, and we're looking to see them go from 5 down to 1 or 4 down to 1. Yeah? So we're looking, our aim is for the drug to make the patient pain-free. And what we would expect is that the intervention group, they go within an hour, they go down to 1, or within 2 hours they go down to 1, and the control group and the placebo group, their levels of pain don't change. And that would prove that the drug works. Wouldn't it? Could you then say in that study that paracetamol is an effective analgesia for a headache? Anybody going to answer that question? Absolutely. There's an awful lot of questions that would still exist, wouldn't there? Firstly, it relies on the perception of pain. So it relies on us making sure that all the participants in this study had a similar perception of pain, and that would be very difficult. It would depend on the sample size, absolutely. When we talk about a randomised control trial, we are often, the sample size is often determined by statistics, and a statistician will tell you that they need statistical significance, that they need the probability to be greater if they've had the drug than not. So when we talk about a randomised control trial, we talk about the advantages of minimising bias and confounding extraneous variables. So one of the things that we would do is make sure that none of those people in those control group, intervention group or placebo group had any other intervention. So they couldn't have anything else happening. They couldn't have a relaxation technique, or they couldn't have an additional drug, or they couldn't have a certain type of a drink. They couldn't have, so they would have, all the other variables would have to be the same. They would have to be in the same environment, having the same food, having the same drink. And then we would look at probability, so we would be looking at sample size. So increase the probability that any observed difference between the groups is due to the experimental variable, so that the probability value is greater. So we're looking at the sample has got to tell us in a statistical test, and it doesn't matter which statistical test is particularly chosen, and there are thousands of statistical tests out there, but the statistical test needs to tell us that it is the paracetamol or the particular drug that has created the difference and not anything else. And so we're looking at a large number, as we would need to test thousands of people to prove that it was paracetamol that was an effective pain relief. So if you look at these adverts that say that there was a X percentage reduction of wrinkles in a sample size of 12, and 10 of them said that there was a reduction in their wrinkles, and I'm sure you've seen these adverts on telly, that does not prove that that product works, does it? Because that is not a big enough sample size and a big enough proportion of that sample size to prove that that was the thing, i.e. the intervention caused the change. So in our very simplistic example, it is not the paracetamol that caused the reduction in pain. It could have been time. It could have been, the list is endless. So unless we had a sample size of 20,000 people and 19,990 of them said that it was the paracetamol, and even then we could only say that in that particular time, in that particular group, it was found that paracetamol was an effective painkiller. So that's not proving anything, is it? Because control over the variables of the intervention enables the researcher to clarify the direction of cause and effect. So it is X that actually definitively caused Y. Only experiment in research design can, in principle, demonstrate cause and effect, and therefore a randomized control trial involving any human beings is very, very difficult, isn't it? Because we don't have complete control. So the difficulties or the disadvantages of randomized control: it's difficult to design an experiment that represents a specific population. So we chose 20 to 30-year-olds with a headache. Well, how could we design, represent that specific population? Because we couldn't test every single 20 to 30-year-old, could we? It's difficult to exclude all confounding variables. So if we were looking at a particular study that was looking at quality of care, and we wanted to say that the quality of care is better when X happens, we wouldn't be able to prove that because we wouldn't be able to control staff, time, motivation, organisational constraints. So if we used an example of quality of care rather than our paracetamol example, what would be the other confounding variables? If we go back to our group of 20 to 30-year-olds with a headache, what were our other confounding variables? Diet, stress, BMI, physical fitness. So many other confounding variables could influence the results. And if there are too many variables, it is difficult to isolate that the one variable that we're testing, the one thing that we're asking, is the one that changed. So in a natural setting, this is not always possible. And this is where we go to, in healthcare settings, an experimental design is not really appropriate. So it's why we call them quasi-experimental designs. Certain variables are out of the control of the researcher. And one of the key aspects to that is everybody deserves the same treatment or the same care. So in our paracetamol example, somebody said it would have been unethical to withhold painkillers. So what we might have to do instead of a randomized control group in our example is compare one type of drug to the other. So how does paracetamol compare to ibuprofen? Yeah, so they're both having painkillers and we're going to compare one to the other. But again, that's fraught with a whole other set of complications. One of the things that we always talk about when we talk about any kind of research study is the volunteers and the people that sign up to do research. Often, not always, but often are not typical of the rest of the population. And in education, we always suggest this. And I'm sure if you looked at quality of care, patient surveys in trusts, you would find exactly the same thing. The people who speak out are the people that have got extremes of experiences. So if we were looking at a quality of care analysis of a particular ward environment and we were measuring the quality of care from patient experience questionnaires, what you would find is people who had fantastic care would respond, and people who had dreadful care would respond, and all of the people in the middle who had satisfactory care don't respond. So the people who sign up for research studies are the people that are invested in a particular subject or enjoy being part of a research study. And so they're not always typical of the population, because we can't research a whole population ever. So another set of things to think about when we're doing a randomized control trial yes, so somebody made the example, the TV programs, One Born Every Minute, are not representative of those women who have babies. No, absolutely not. But we could say that about anything on television, couldn't we? I.e., you know, those people in EastEnders aren't representative people who live in the East End. I don't watch One Born Every Minute, so... Oh, right, okay, it's a personal... Yeah, absolutely. It's a reality show, though, so it's all absolutely true. Another thing to think about when we look at randomized control trial is something we call the Hawthorne effect. And I'm sure most of you have heard this expression of the Hawthorne effect. And the idea of the Hawthorne effect is not specific to randomized control trials, but it's specific to any data collection scenario. People behave differently when they're being observed. So if I was doing an ethnographic study on hand washing, and I said I was going to watch everybody wash their hands, they're all going to start washing their hands properly. So I'm not necessarily going to get an accurate assessment of people's ability to wash their hands. If I've asked you to become part of a study to evaluate the effectiveness of a painkiller when suffering from a headache, that's exactly what you're looking for. So if I give you a tablet, you're going to feel better, which goes back to the principles of using a placebo. If I give you a pill, you will feel better. Now, if we're doing an experiment and we've used a control group and we've given them a placebo, is it ethical to give somebody a sugar tablet? And we do it all the time. So it is ethical as long as they're informed. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about experimenter expectations. They are being tested. So they are expecting something to change. The Hawthorne effect is an issue in all research. I was using an ethnographic example, but in all research. the Hawthorne effect is something to think about. People, if they have engaged in research, behave differently. In phenomenological research, if you're asking somebody to discuss a specific phenomenon, they are going to tell you about it, and they are going to possibly tell you what you want to hear. So if my research, and I have to tell my subjects what I'm researching, if I'm looking at how it feels to be a student, they might tell me the extremes of that phenomenon. So whenever you're doing any kind of research, any kind of data collection, you have to be aware of the subjects giving you the answers that they think that you want, and behaving differently because of the fact that you're watching them. So in a randomized control trial, we often pilot a test, and we do some pre-testing during piloting, and they will react differently to the candidates in the main study, possibly because we've refined our data collection techniques, or we've refined our questionnaire, and so on. So there are a lot of factors that come into play when we're analysing the data we collect on any of our research approaches. We've talked a little bit about this already in the... Oh, I don't know why there's no sound. Has everybody still got sound? Just got a few people saying that there's no sound. Oh, right, it's back. Okay, great. Fantastic. Okay, we've talked a little bit about the placebo groups and having a placebo group, and hopefully you've all heard about heard that term before. It's the control for the psychological effects of the treatment. So patients receive an inert substance that looks like what we're testing. So going back to our paracetamol example, or our painkiller example, we might be giving everybody a small white tablet, and so the placebo would be a small white tablet, so that everybody thinks that they're getting the same thing. So the psychological effects are from the drug and not from the physical act of giving you a treatment. Hope that makes sense. So you can have a blind placebo, so this is concealing the allocation of the people to the experimental, to the control group. So the subjects themselves do not know whether they're getting the drug or the placebo. And a double blind is you conceal it from both. So you give everybody a white tablet, they're randomly allocated a number, and certain numbers got the drug and certain numbers didn't. They got the placebo. The benefit of having a double-blind study is the researcher isn't specifically looking for success in the treatment group and non-success in the placebo group. Hopefully that makes sense. So the principles of a double-blind placebo trial are that nobody knows whether they're getting the treatment or not, and then you have a better or a more accurate assumption as to whether it's the drug that has caused the change and not something else, and not the fact that you were given a pill. So moving on to the ideas of sampling and selection. Why do we use a sample? Well, we can't test a whole population. So if we wanted to find out what everybody who had a baby felt about something, we could not ask every single person that had had a baby over the course of time. So we select a group of people. And a random sample can allow the researcher to generalize from the sample to the population as a whole. Now that's fraught with problems, isn't it? Because our sampling strategy influences the people is influenced by the subject that we choose, the ontology and the epistemology that we come from, and the methodology that we are going to employ. So when we talk about sampling, we talk about an inclusion and exclusion criteria, and we talk about representativeness. So our inclusion criteria, going back to our simplistic headache example, is we're going to use including people who are 20 to 30 that have a headache that is scored on a particular pain score of 4 or 5. Our exclusion criteria might be that they don't speak English, that they have never suffered from a headache before, that they are allergic to paracetamol, and they have a specific past medical history. With that group of people, can you generalise to everybody with a headache? No, you can't. All you can say is that this sample is representative of 20 to 30-year-olds with headaches. So if we were doing this test, all we could say is that in 20 to 30-year-olds with no previous medical history who followed this particular inclusion criteria, paracetamol was the most effective analgesia. So have we proved that paracetamol is the best analgesia for headaches? So we have to be very, very careful about what we suggest when we design our study. Because if you are seeking to prove that X equals Y, you have to be very specific about the questions that you ask and the people that you ask. If we compare this the ideas of quantitative sampling to qualitative sampling, we use non-probability sampling in qualitative research. The emphasis here is on discovering more about a phenomena and the people with a specific. So if we were asking people with headaches, we would just want people with headaches. So often we use the terms convenience sampling. So convenience sampling are easy to recruit and close in proximity. So by that, if we were using a convenient sampling of people with headaches, we might go out onto the nearest main road and ask the first 20 people if they'd had a headache. That wouldn't necessarily prove anything though, would it? You couldn't prove anything by asking the first 20 people who walked past you with a headache. But then if you're asking a qualitative question, you're not seeking to prove anything anyway. So you have to be really sure about what you're asking, why you're asking them, and how you're going to go about the question. So we talk about convenience sampling. We also talk about purposive sampling. And this is deliberate non-random method of sampling, a group with a particular characteristic. And it's often combined with convenience sampling. So we might say a group of people with a particular characteristic in a particular geographical area. So I might want to sample 20 to 30-year-olds with a headache who came to Boots to buy paracetamol. So I picked these people on purpose. I've picked people with headaches, and I picked them from in a convenient way. Also, we might use theoretical sampling, so a group that knows something specific about something. So using the example I've got there, is we might talk about students. So if I was asking what it felt like to be a first-year student nurse, and you may or may not be aware that today is the first day of the undergraduate pre-registration program, so we've got 200 plus, well, we've got about 300 brand new first-year nurses pitched up at university today, or they've pitched up over the weekend. They're all wandering around campus today looking like rabbits in headlights. with maps. If we wanted to do a piece of theoretical sampling on them, we might get them together in a group this week, and we might ask them specific questions about how it felt to be a first year and how it felt on your first day of university. We're asking them specifically because we know that they know how it feels to be a first year, because they are first year student nurses. So depending on the question that you're asking will depend on the group of people that you're asking. And we would suggest that they know how it feels because they are that group of people. You might say to yourself, well, how am I going to prove or establish what it is like to be a first year student nurse? Well, that goes back to your ontology and your epistemology. I am not seeking to prove something. I am seeking to investigate a phenomena. I am seeking to understand and therefore be aware of the complexities of being a first year student. So I can use theoretical sampling. I don't need a randomized controlled trial because I'm not seeking to prove anything. This is where understanding your research perspective is so important in developing your research proposal and therefore going on to develop your dissertation. Because if you know where you're coming from and you know the question that you're asking, the research proposal sort of falls into place. Because if I'm asking this particular question, I'm going to need to answer it in this particular way. And therefore, I am going to be guided by the way I'm thinking about a particular question and the way I'm going to answer it. The disadvantages, of course, are that you can't say that every student nurse feels this way. All you can say is that every student nurse in Plymouth in 2014 feels this way. Now, that is transferable to the general population of students. You could say that there are many themes that might come out of that study that you could transfer to people in new environments anywhere. But there are also going to be some data that is specific to this group of people at this particular time. Now, up to now I've been talking about sort of very purist ideas of research, that you've come from one perspective or another, and your ontology or epistemology or methodology are definitely from one perspective or the other. You either are seeking to prove something or you are seeking to investigate, understand something. But we talk about post-positivist thinking in research because it is very much appreciated that the best of both worlds and getting the most holistic picture about a relationship is to come at it from a number of perspectives. That's fine, Julie. I've nearly finished. So integrated quantitative and qualitative designs. So if you were doing a qualitative study that sought to understand what it felt like to be a student nurse, you might use a quantitative questionnaire with one of those I agree, disagree scores to begin with, that would from that elicit some specific questions that you might want to ask in the form of a questionnaire with open-ended questions, or in the form of an interview, or in the form of a focus group. So you could actually get a much more holistic view of a picture by adopting a number of different approaches. But your ontology, your epistemology, your methodology, and in essence your research question would come from one perspective or the other. The way you answer it may be drawn from both sides. And what we call that is, we call that a triangulation approach, that using multiple methods increases the validity so that multiple realities can be tracked. So using the principles of a questionnaire and an interview and a focus group and maybe some case study analysis. And by adopting a number of methods of data collection from qualitative and quantitative research paradigms, we get a much more holistic view or a holistic answer. Okay, any questions? Right, it's approaching 3:30, so I'm more or less finished now. If you've got any questions, then please, I'll stay on air for another few minutes, or just go back to the last slide. It's all the slides are on the DLE. All the PowerPoint presentations are up there in actual format. Of course, this recording will be uploaded later. But the physical presentation is available on the DLE. Okay. Any other questions? So that was very much an introduction to research, an introduction to the research. Yeah, I've never used the PU chat room before, so I might have to come and see you about that, Rachel. Rebecca, yes, I will email you the slides when I get back to my office, and hopefully your DLE site will be, or access will be sorted in the next few days. Any questions about the content or the resources available? All right. Belinda's come in with a question about one of her research questions. I can't give you a definitive answer on that. It is a broad question. You've said, what are the benefits and limitations of a cancer risk assessment in women with a family history of breast cancer? Or what are the benefits of cancer risk assessments globally? I think what you will need to do, and I know this sounds a little bit like a cop-out, is you're going to have to read to see what's been done. I would suggest, and I'm pretty sure, that there are a couple of studies already looking at the efficacy and the benefits and limitations of risk assessments specifically focused on women with breast cancer. And I think in light of recent advances, there will be quite an extensive amount of research about, gene and testing and and those sort of things. So you will find that there's lots of research out there. What might be the key is to have a look at the literature that's been out there, certainly in the last 5 years, review what's been written, and you can refine your search very much to what's been written in the UK and focus very much on that, and see if you can adapt a study that's already been done, or look at it from a different perspective, or maybe pick a particular area that's highlighted in other research and take that further. Because one of the key things here is that you do not have to reinvent the wheel. You do not have to come up with an idea that's never been researched and never been discussed. In fact, you'd be better off to find something that has been researched, and I would suggest that cancer risk assessments generally is a very broad subject, And there will be so much written out there about this particular subject area that you will have to focus it to a breast cancer focus. And I'd say that to everybody. If you've got a subject area that has been written about extensively, you will have to refine it down because there will be too much out there. But you filtering through and the refining of the research material is only going to happen once you start reading. And that sounds like a bit of a cop-out, doesn't it? And I don't mean to. The facts are that you will have to just start reading around your subject area. I hope that answers your question. Any other questions? Okay, going back to what I said right at the beginning, I'm not delivering the next session. I am, Heather Skirton is delivering the next one in a fortnight's time. So you will receive your webinar invitations just like you did for today from Heather. I will be available for email and tutorial support on that Monday if you've got any questions, any queries, and I'll look forward to hearing from you then. Otherwise, I will say goodbye for today. And as I said, the slides are up, and the recording will be loaded as soon as possible. Thank you very much, everybody.